Down 2 scores with 20 minutes left on the clock, this preseason game had already turned into background noise for most of the league watching along. And then the Raiders decided it hadn't. Final score, 22-20. And I know exactly how many of you are ready to roll your eyes at that sentence because it's still just preseason. Fair enough. Slap whatever qualifier you want on it. A comeback is still a comeback, and there's a lot buried inside this box score that the final number alone isn't going to tell you. I'll be honest, I walked into this one expecting a fairly forgettable evening. Most of Houston's recognizable names weren't suited up. Most of the Raiders' familiar starters weren't either. After last week's workload, and games built around that much roster churn usually settle into a quiet, mistake-filled stretch that matters more to coaches charting depth than to anyone actually looking for entertainment. Instead, we got a genuine roller coaster. A rookie quarterback absorbing his first real gut punch. A couple of performances worth remembering long after this week. And a finish that actually meant something to the guys fighting for real roster spots. Fernando Mendoza took the first snaps of the night, and that alone was worth staying locked in for. Houston's starters were nowhere on the field. This was mostly depth and rotational pieces on their side, but this is still a Texans roster carrying more overall depth than what Las Vegas is currently working with. So it wasn't exactly a soft look either. Mendoza opened things up in serious fashion, connecting on an 80-yard touchdown almost immediately to get this offense on the board. For a few minutes, it genuinely looked like the kind of opening drive that sets the tone for an entire half. Then the pick six happened, and the rhythm of the whole game shifted with it. I want to be careful about how I frame this one, because I don't actually think the mistake itself is the real story here. Rookies throw interceptions. Rookies get read by veteran defenders who've seen every disguise a young quarterback is capable of throwing at them by this point in their careers. What matters more to me is what happens after a play like that. And this is genuinely the exact environment where a young quarterback should be allowed to make that mistake. A preseason game against a scrambled roster carries zero real stakes. If this were week 10 with the season on the line, we'd be having a completely different conversation right now. Here it's just data, and data is supposed to include some noise. The offense never quite found its footing again for the rest of that half. There were flashes in the run game, and Mendoza found his tight end early on a gain that had me thinking a second scoring drive was building, but the rhythm just wasn't there once that interception hit. He finished the day 8 for 86 yards, the one pick returned for a score, and a sack to go with it. Though I'll give him real credit for hustling downfield, trying to keep that sack from turning into something even worse. He didn't get much help in front of him either. The offensive line struggled badly at stretches, and on that particular sack, the interior simply couldn't hold up, one defensive lineman basically walking straight through untouched to get to him. That's not on the quarterback. That's on the protection, full stop. And it wasn't just the line letting him down. Malik Benson, the receiver, this entire fan base has been buzzing about all camp, had a rough afternoon by his own standards. There was a third down opportunity where Mendoza put a genuinely good ball on him, the kind of throw that extends a drive and swings momentum right back in the Raiders' favor, and he simply couldn't bring it in. Then, on a separate target later, the ball got knocked loose right as he was securing it. 2 drops in a game where his quarterback needed every bit of help he could get. That's the kind of afternoon that happens sometimes. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt the offense's ability to build anything sustained through the middle portion of this one. So where does that leave me on Mendoza after a stat line like this? Honestly, nowhere close to worried. I already know the media cycle is going to run wild with a pick 6 and an 8 for 15 line, calling it a warning sign, maybe worse. I'm not buying into that reaction, and here's exactly why. This is precisely the environment where you want a rookie quarterback absorbing lessons like this, in a game that means nothing on the standings, against a defense that isn't showing him anything resembling a real disguise for the first time in his career. There's no urgency to rush him onto the field come September. Kirk Cousins is this team's starter. That hasn't changed. And barring something happening to Cousins that nobody wants to see, there's no reason Mendoza needs meaningful snaps for the rest of this year at all. Let him develop on his own timeline. Let him make these mistakes now, in August, when the only real cost is a stat line, and not a football game that actually counts. It's worth zooming out and remembering what these preseason reps are actually designed to accomplish for a rookie quarterback sitting exactly where Mendoza sits right now. Nobody drafted him expecting him to start immediately behind a line, still figuring itself out, throwing to a receiver room, still building chemistry with him in real time. The value in these games isn't the final stat line at all. It's whether the process underneath that stat line shows progress week over week. Does he see pressure a beat faster than he did last time out? Does he trust his first read a little quicker? Those are the things a coaching staff is actually charting behind closed doors. And none of that shows up cleanly in a line that just reads 8 for 15 with a pick 6 attached to it. What I'll actually take from this game is the process, not the box score. There were real flashes buried in there. He stood in against pressure multiple times and delivered accurate throws into tight windows instead of bailing early, which is one of the harder traits to teach a young quarterback and one of the clearest signs of genuine pocket confidence. He took a hit more than once and still got the ball out clean instead of flinching. Those are the reps that matter more long-term than a completion percentage from a mid-August exhibition against backups. And I loved watching Max Crosby jog straight over to him right after that interception, throw an arm around him, and remind him that football isn't going to be perfect, that this is part of being a rookie, and that the response is what actually matters. That's veteran leadership doing exactly what it's supposed to do in a moment like that. And honestly, it says as much about the locker room this staff is building as anything that happened between the lines tonight. Now, the real bright spot of that first half for me, before everything that unfolded late, was Mike Washington. This guy continues to be an absolute problem for opposing defenses, and I'll die on this hill happily. He's shown me enough through 2 preseason games now to make the case that he should have gone off the board considerably earlier than he did on draft weekend. There was a play where Caleb Rogers got pushed straight back into the backfield, the kind of rep that should die right there behind the line of scrimmage. And Washington still found a crease, absorbed contact at the point of attack, and somehow turned it into a 33-yard run anyway. That's not scheme. That's not a blocking win up front. That's a player creating something out of structurally nothing. And that's the exact trait that separates a solid backup from a guy who eventually forces his way into a real role. What makes that specific run stand out even more on review is the contact balance involved. A lot of backs in this league get touched behind the line, and that's simply the play, tackle for loss, move on to second down. Washington absorbed that initial hit, kept his pad level low enough to bounce off contact, and still had the vision to find a crease that wasn't even part of the original design. That's not something you can fully coach into a player. Vision like that under duress is either present or it isn't. And through 2 games now, it's clearly present in his game. Pair him with Ashton Jonty in this backfield. And if both of these two play anywhere near their ceiling, this offense is going to have a run game that genuinely terrifies opposing coordinators. 2 completely different styles complementing each other in a system clearly being built to run the ball first. Jonty brings the between the tackles power and the vision to set up his blockers, while Washington brings this loose, elusive quality that turns busted plays into explosive ones. Before the fourth quarter turned into what it turned into, Washington was my easy pick for player of the game, and he's going to be a real problem in this league for a long time. Let's get into the defense now, because this side of the ball gave me legitimate reasons for concern, at least early on. None of the starters played. No Crosby, obviously, since he'd already gone through his workload the way this staff has been managing him all camp. No Nico, no Quay, no Isaiah on the back end. What we got instead was a heavy dose of young depth pieces trying to prove something, and I was already a little nervous about this exact group after how shaky the defensive depth looked against Arizona the week before. This week, that concern didn't get resolved. If anything, it looked just as loose early. The run defense couldn't hold up for long stretches. Houston's offense, even without its top-end pieces on the field, moved the ball with real rhythm and converted 3 straight third downs at one point during a sustained drive. The first touchdown Houston scored came off multiple missed tackles on a single play, a runner casually finishing into the end zone because nobody wrapped up and finished the job. Tackling issues like that tend to get dismissed as an August thing, and to some extent they are, but I still think it's worth naming plainly instead of waving it off entirely. Missed tackles compound. One broken tackle turns a modest gain into an explosive play. And explosive plays are exactly what put a defense in conflict on the very next snap, forced into simplified calls, instead of the disguises and pressures a coordinator actually wants to run. Watching that happen repeatedly against a Houston offense that wasn't even playing its best players is the part that should get cleaned up in practice over the next couple of weeks, regardless of who ultimately ends up making this roster. I want to be clear that I'm not extending that concern to the actual starting defense or to Rob Leonard as a coordinator. Not yet, and honestly not based on this sample. If this were the regular season, and it was the real starting unit playing this loose, that would be a 5-alarm fire. But this is preseason, and the entire point of these snaps is figuring out what's genuinely on this roster in terms of depth, who's ready for a bigger role, and who clearly isn't there yet. A good chunk of what we saw suggests a lot of these young players simply aren't ready for significant snaps right now. And that's useful information heading into cutdowns, even when it isn't fun to watch in the moment. Give credit where it's due, though, because that same group tightened up considerably in the second half. There was a forced fumble that got the ball back for the offense, then another separate forced fumble later in the game, and pressure up front that helped change the entire complexion of this thing once the fourth quarter arrived. Those two takeaways specifically were the difference between this staying a discouraging loss and turning into the kind of finish that gets replayed in every group chat for a week. Which brings me to the fourth quarter, because that's genuinely where this whole game turned into something worth remembering. We knew going in that Aidan O'Connell was going to get his run with the third team unit. And honestly, there was a part of me thinking, if he can't move the ball with this specific group around him, we're going to have some real questions to ask about where he actually stands on this roster long term. Instead, he went out there and delivered exactly what this offense needed at the exact moment it needed it. This is a quarterback who's had about as difficult a path as anyone could draw up since getting drafted here. Multiple coordinators cycling through in just a few seasons, and he still walked out and orchestrated a genuine comeback with the least experienced group on the entire roster around him. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is exactly the kind of performance that keeps a career like his alive in this league. Backup quarterbacks who can walk into total chaos, almost no continuity around them, a third-string supporting cast, and still put together a functional winning drive under real-time pressure. Those are valuable pieces on any roster, regardless of who's holding the starting job. Whatever role he ends up occupying this season, tonight was a reminder that when his number gets called, he tends to answer. Dylan Laube ran the ball with real physicality in that closing stretch, breaking tackles, and picking up chunks of yardage exactly when this team needed it. Another back punched in a 19-yard touchdown run that injected real life back into this offense at the moment it needed it most. Then, with under 2 minutes left on the clock, the defense forced one more stop to give the ball right back to O'Connell, and he delivered arguably the throw of the entire game. A beautiful downfield connection to Brandon Johnson that set up the go-ahead score. Forced turnover into a game-winning drive with the clock bleeding out. That's the kind of sequence that makes you forget how rough the first 3 quarters actually looked on tape. A few other things worth flagging before I wrap this one up. Jamal McCoy looked noticeably better in coverage this week compared to his opener. Not a perfect performance. He picked up an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty for taunting that felt like a genuinely soft call from the officiating crew. But the important part is he wasn't getting torched deep the way he was in week 1. Real progress, even with a flag attached to it. Treyon Stokes flashed a few plays worth tracking too, as this roster continues to get sorted out. On a tougher note, one of the quarterbacks on this roster got carted off with what looked like a knee injury and left the game early, and I genuinely hope that turns out to be nothing serious, because nobody wants to see a young player's camp end that way, regardless of where he sits on the depth chart. Last thing, and I need to talk about the kicking situation because it's becoming impossible to ignore at this point. The kicker fighting for a roster spot missed 2 more field goals in this game, putting him at 3 missed kicks across these first 2 preseason outings, if you're counting last week too. I don't think that competition is trending in his favor anymore. Matt Gay went out and drilled a 50-plus yard field goal in this same game, and that kind of leg strength in a big moment tends to settle these roster battles pretty quickly on its own. As it stands right now, I'd genuinely be surprised if the other guy makes this roster heading into final cuts. Overall, I'm a happy fan tonight. This wasn't a clean performance from top to bottom. There's real work still to be done at multiple spots, especially up front on both sides of the ball and with tackling fundamentals on defense. But this team didn't fold when folding would have been the easy path. Didn't just accept a sloppy first 3 quarters as the final word on the day, and found a way to finish the job with the guys who've had to fight the hardest for their opportunities on this roster. That's a quality worth banking, preseason or not. The Niners come to town next, and I'm genuinely ready for that one.